showing up on time. I think the speakers had a very tight schedule, so they just arrived. I'm going to do a quick introduction of you all. Everything is set up, and give you a chance to go ahead. Just let me introduce the speakers first. So both of them are academics in Hong Kong. They've been doing research for a long time in Africa, and especially in Ethiopia, where, like in Sri Lanka, it's considered a poster child for concern about Chinese engagement and lending. Sri Lanka has become that poster child ever since really Humboldt report was leased out, and there has been a lot of interest created in Sri Lanka. And if I just say a little bit about each of them, Jan Hairong, who is first to my left, is based in Hong Kong Polytechnic University. Her interests are quite wide-ranging. They include labor, gender, rurality, rural-urban relations, and collective cooperative rural economy. And I won't go into lots of detail because there's a lot about her, you can read about her, but let me mention some of the books that she's worked on and things she's published. She's the author of what's called New Masters, New Servants, Migration, Development, and Women Workers in China, published by Duke University. She's also been collaborating with Barry Sautman, who's also presenting today, on China-Africa links, and co-authored a book called East Asian Mountain Tiger, West Mountain Tiger, China, Africa, the West and Colonialism. Basically, her publications have long titles. Which is published in the internet. So I think a lot of publications are in the US. Barry's been in Colombia before he came to Hong Kong. And she also publishes in several journals that's to do with agrarian peasant studies. Barry Sautman is a political scientist, lawyer at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, has worked on ethnic politics in China, including ethnic policies, the Tibet issues, and relations between Hong Kong people and mainland Chinese. He has co-authored with Yan as well, as you know, and also, I think particularly interesting is this title, Localists and Localists in Hong Kong, creating a yellow-red peril discourse. So there is a bit of discourse analysis that will come into this presentation also about how China is looked at, and that's published in Baltimore University. I think today's seminar is focusing specifically on the research they've done together on Ethiopia. So what we are saying is that most of the time when we encounter this question about how to understand China's Belt and Road Initiative, there are two main sources for the discourse. One is from China itself, obviously, and unsurprisingly, that will be a predominantly positive discourse that is led by, in a sense, the state itself. And of course, the state has a great deal of influence, obviously, in how other institutions within the state carry out their discourse internationally. But then we also have an alternative discourse that emanates from the West and is often led by the United States. That then is quite a contrary discourse that, in contrast to the very positive discourse coming from China about the BRI, has turned out to be a very negative discourse that looks at the risks and threats of China's actions and presents it in the light of a problem rather than a solution. So what we have tried to do today is to say there is a third narrative on China, which is what Verite itself has been thinking based on the studies we are doing and research we are doing. Some of you subscribe to our political analysis, where we do weekly analysis as well as once in 4 months we do a macro-political analysis. And for some of you, we have presented our views on China and our analysis on Chinese action, which I think fits the third narrative. That's going to be discussed today, and I will maybe end the session with recapping a couple of the analysis we have with regard to how we understand China's investments or actions in Sri Lanka. So I don't want to take more time. We've called it the third narrative using Ethiopia and the research done in Ethiopia to reconstruct a narrative that is, perhaps in ways different to what China and the West are saying about the Belt and Road Initiative. Barry, I think you're going to start us off with, or is it Jan? Yeah.
Sure.
So let me then give you the floor, and thank you very much for being here with us. Yes.
Well, thank you very much for coming, and sorry for us being a little bit late. And I'll be the first one to speak, cover the first half of the presentation, and then Barry will take on from the second part of the presentation. So the title of our talk is a third narrative. So indeed, we're actually picking up the kind of binary which has been emerging about the Belt and Road Initiative coming from China. And our talk will be most based on the Ethiopian model. And obviously, we have to research here in Sri Lanka, and we see certain kind of similarity, but also, of course, differences between the two cases. We've done a little bit more research in Ethiopia, which have just started with our research in Sri Lanka. So today, we're going to share our experiences mostly about Ethiopia. By and large, Belt and Road Initiative in China has become a mobilization. And it is mobilization focusing mostly on infrastructure building and as well investment in developing countries. And that comes, of course, with projects. By fall 2018, it involved about 2,200 deals spread across 87 countries. And in fact, the definition of Belt and Road countries also have been expanding, going beyond the initial conceptualization of Belt and Road. And China, therefore, had pledged about $126 billion of investment by 2018, and $350 billion more are expected for the next 4 or 5 year period. And as mobilization, some Western analysts have been focusing on one aspect of BRI only, that is infrastructure and investment as linked with geopolitical goals. However, there are other analysts who would see BRI as something different, as engaging in multiple aims to mitigate, for example, China's industrial overcapacity, to deploy its huge foreign reserve in developing countries, because the outlets for Chinese foreign reserve has been quite limited. And we can discuss that in a Q&A period. And internationalization of its currency and spread of its technical standards, and also reduce the supply chain costs, and also spur the development of its large ethnic minority Western regions within China itself, but also going beyond, and guarantee the access to natural resources, strengthen its energy security, etc. So it's multiple aims all included in this Belt and Road Initiative, rather than one single aim itself. In fact, there have been 5 goals being pronounced about BRI. One is policy coordination, collectivity of infrastructure and facilities, and more unimpeded trade and financial integration, and also close people-to-people ties. So that, again, is articulation of multiple dimensions of the BRI goals. The actors of BRI in China are also multiple, involving different levels of actors. The central government, but also provincial governments are very, very active. Some of them perhaps have pushed more for BRI for its provincial strategies. And there is military, of course, military financial institutions involved in it. There are banks in China, especially China Development Bank, China Exim Bank, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Banks. These are the major financial institutions involved in the BRI. And there are also national and subnational state-owned enterprises, private firms, academics, NGOs, etc., involved, all mobilized into the BRI framework. And pretty much all provinces in China have their own BRI plans, or they have organized meetings, coordinating visits between the provinces and the countries which they're interested in. However, BRI itself, rather than being a very coordinated, tightly knit kind of framework is actually rather loose. In fact, many interests, quote, can use it for their own and economically motivated agenda with little consideration for Beijing's wider diplomatic objectives. So different actors are bringing their own different understandings and agenda, pushing the BRI itself. And that's generating rather chaotic and quote-unquote bottom-up process of selecting and funding projects. And BRI projects by sectors are basically power. This is the data up to 2018. Power, in terms of number of projects, is about 41%, of which 22% is for hydro, 12% for coal, 7% other sources. And then transport, 30% in total, and then 19% for rail, 7% for roads, 8% for ports and others. And there's also manufacturing, about 13%. And then other projects take about 12%. And between 2013 and 2018, the 5-year period, Chinese entities basically have invested about $86 billion in BRI countries. And that's building about 82 economic and trade development zones and creating about 240,000 jobs. And Chinese policy banks plan to use $900 million for the period of 2013 to 2049 to finance BRI projects. Western elites tend to measure projects, including BRI projects, success only in terms of commercial returns and within a very narrow, limited time window, which typically tend to be 3 to 5 years. But Chinese tend to use a longer time framework and perspective when they engage in especially infrastructure projects. So they measure, Chinese not only measure as profit, but also other social and political considerations come into play when they contemplate projects. So that brings up something of a dispute. Sometimes Western media perspective might call a project white elephant, while from Chinese perspective, it's not. So that comes to different perspective and measurements of projects. And China also tends to take riskier projects and deliver results a bit faster than non-Chinese firms. That has been the case mostly in Africa, but in other developing countries as well. And for some analysts, the BRI is a mere basket to place all Chinese investment infrastructure building projects into a new framework. While for other people, they tend to see it as heightened capital flow to BRI countries. And that indicates that BRI is more than just a branding of projects that's both existing and being planned. And our conclusion, based on our experiences and continued sort of interest research, has been that Ethiopian and other cases show that BRI is neither an original, transformative development paradigm. It doesn't represent a new kind of development paradigm, nor is it a strategy for geopolitical aggrandizement or economic predation. So we are creating, again, our own kind of narrative beyond these two binaries. It's not as claimed as the US-led media counter-mobilization would have it, that is against the BRI, which began, the media campaign against BRI began in the fall of 2017 up to present. And that discourse mostly centers on the yellow peril fantasy of the Chinese are coming and as presenting menace to the world, and of the BRI itself as a Chinese death trap. So although not unproblematic, the BRI is largely what it claims to be. That is, it's a stepped-up provision of investment and infrastructure that benefits, hopefully, that aims to bring benefits both to China and host countries. And that's in part because the project conceptualization themselves, by and large, comports with developing countries' own development agenda. For example, most of the projects, including projects here in Sri Lanka, the Hambantota port, particularly was conceptualized by the Sri Lankan government. In fact, the plan or the idea of building that port began decades ago, way before Chinese engagement. So that would be the case with many of the infrastructure projects that Chinese become engaged in through the BRI, that the initial idea of building infrastructure came with the developing countries' own development plans. And China expects increased political support through these projects or economic benefits from the BRI states. But they actually cannot require, cannot demand those benefits. And oftentimes they don't necessarily receive it. There's a lot of fluctuation in the kinds of governments that developing countries have, and therefore the relationship do fluctuate, and there's no guarantee of benefits coming out from those investments. Moreover, unlike the United States, China cannot sanction disobliging developing countries through lawsuits, through embargoes, or through forcible regime change. China could do none of that. So in that marks distinctive characteristics of Chinese presence or Chinese engagement of BRI countries. Okay, I think the next part to Barry.
Thanks. So I'll now say a bit about BRI in Africa, because originally the BRI was not conceived of centered upon Eurasia, the whole belt going from the Chinese seaboard on the one hand all the way to perhaps Rotterdam in the Netherlands, but certainly not to Africa. But Africa has 33 of the world's 47 least developed countries. Interaction between China and those countries, of course, can mitigate the low level of public, human, and institutional capital. And top Chinese media, of course, never has said that the Belt and Road is an altruistic endeavor. It's kind of a red herring in the Western media. Journalists write articles trying to show that it's not altruistic, that it's not just philanthropy. But the Chinese government has never said that the Belt and Road is just altruistic. Rather, it's designed to boost ties with developing countries, particularly in Africa, to provide new markets for labor, for goods, and to standardize technologies. In other words, to do things which perhaps are beneficial to the host countries, but also beneficial to China. And African states have reciprocated by giving considerable political support to China on various issues important to it, the Tibet issue, the Taiwan issue, South China Sea issue, etc. For example, 39 of the 55 African countries have made statements supporting China on the South China Sea issue, even though they're a very long way away from the South China Sea. Well, Africa, of course, is a situs for Chinese investment, but China's FDI stock in Africa is only 6 to 7% of global FDI in the continent. So China is not a major investment player in Africa in the way that is commonly portrayed in the global media. It's not insignificant, but it is not the major one by any means. There are about 10,000 Chinese firms operating in Africa, and a study that was done in 2017 showed that for every 1% increase in the proportion of the Chinese stock to the total stock of FDI in Africa means a boost of Africa's GDP growth by 0.6%. As you can see, almost 1/5 of Africa's trade is now with China. And China has lent a very considerable amount of money to African governments, $132 billion from 2000 to 2016. But only about 1/3 of those funds have gone for natural resource development, contrary again to the way that the global media portrays things. So that was BRI in Africa in general. I'll now go on to talk a little bit about Ethiopia itself. Ethiopia is the second largest country in Africa by population. It's also, in a way, the capital of Africa because the African Union headquarters is there. And the UN Economic Commission on Africa also is in the capital of Ethiopia. Ethiopia is also the fastest growing country in Africa. Average increase of 8.5% per annum in GDP. And its debt to GDP ratio, well, this is the official one that I'm showing, 35%. I don't put much stock in that. It's definitely higher than that. But even if it is higher than that, it's still below the African average in terms of external debt. Of course, Chinese in Africa do some large-scale infrastructure building. And in Ethiopia, that is also true. And it's true as well that in Ethiopia there is considerable Chinese investment in manufacturing, mostly through industrial parks. Sorry.
While you drink water, I'll explain the graph. This is the number of Chinese and non-Chinese FDI projects. So the bar here only shows the number of projects, not the value of projects. So you can see the blue is Chinese and non-Chinese. You have some sense in terms of different Chinese investment in different sectors. You can see that's mainly concentrated in manufacturing and construction. Not so much in other sectors. A little bit in hotel restaurants, Chinese restaurants. A little bit in real estate kinds of activities. Not much in agriculture, not much in electricity, water supply, these kind of sectors. And I'm showing you these are pictures we took of the largest employer now in Ethiopia. It's a shoe manufacturing facility. It's actually the parent company is based in China, in Shenzhen, in Guangdong province. And they have moved some of their manufacturing lines to Ethiopia, and therefore employing thousands of Ethiopian workers, male and female. And these are the global brands they work for. So each line works for one brand. So we have CGA and different kinds of brands being manufactured by these, put together by these workers. And this is a knitting factory. This is a factory operated by Shanghai textile factory. There's a Shanghai provincial level, municipal level SOE, and they produce sweaters like these. And here I enlarge the corner over here, so you can see it's 15 euros. So it's oriented towards European market. So again, they're bringing some of the assembly lines, relocating them to Africa. Now, what this does is actually doesn't mean Chinese enterprises, by relocation, is moving up the value chain or it's changing its position in the value chain. It doesn't. Okay, so changing of productive location. But in terms of where Chinese companies are positioned in the value chain, it's more or less the same, supplying global brands. The only exception we have here is Transsion, which is a cell phone manufacturing company. A lot of people in China have never heard of Transsion because it doesn't sell in mainland China or in Hong Kong. It orients itself exclusively towards other developing countries, particularly in Africa, and it's also marketing in South Asia. And it has 46% of the African market share in cell phones. It's not very expensive. It has different kinds of different grades of cell phones.
By the way, the one that's sold here in Sri Lanka, I think, is Oppo, OPPO. That's manufactured by Transsion. And they have their factory in Ethiopia. They also have a factory now in India.
They have also, they're building factories in Ethiopia. And the level of productivity of the workers is about 60 to 70% of the workers in China.
So Ethiopia, of course, also has some connection with China politically, and the party system in Ethiopia, the ruling party, which has been in power for quite some time, is rather similar to the system that exists for the Chinese Communist Party. So needless to say, there's lots of party-to-party exchanges. Also, Ethiopia, like other African countries, has given great support to China in international organizations, and that's been reciprocated. But concerns about whether Ethiopia could be controlled by China, because China has become a significant investor and financier in Ethiopia, I think underestimate the strength of the Ethiopian political system. Actually, the ruling party is quite strong, and even before that ruling party came to power, governments in Ethiopia historically have been quite strong, and it is by no means a failed state in that regard, but instead it's a country with thousands of years of history and quite a high sense of national consciousness. And in fact, in terms of political influence, our estimation, and I think this has been confirmed by some Ethiopia politics specialists, is that the United States and the United Arab Emirates are the countries that are actually the most influential politically in Ethiopia, despite the fairly strong ties between the ruling party and the Chinese Communist Party. Now, Chinese activity in Ethiopia economically, of course, includes lots of infrastructure building, but we concentrated in our own research in terms of the investment in manufacturing, because Ethiopia has been held up as a model of Chinese investment in manufacturing abroad in the world. And most of this manufacturing takes place in industrial parks. 5 of them are now operational. We visited 3 of them, the three biggest ones. And 7 more are under construction right now. All the construction is being done by Chinese firms because they now have a specialization in the construction of industrial parks. And there are additional ones planned. Some of the additional ones will be run by Chinese companies. Others will be run by the Ethiopian government. And those don't seem to be radically different in the way that they're run. Chinese firms do textiles, they do garments, they do footwear, but they're also involved in a lot of other kinds of manufacturing activity, construction materials particularly, but also auto assembly, auto parts, food processing, etc. About 70% of the Chinese firms that are doing manufacturing in Ethiopia are private firms. And those private firms are generally medium-sized firms. And actually, quite a number of them come from Hong Kong, and we had contact with them there before we even went to Ethiopia. Chinese firms employ over 100,000 Ethiopians. About half of them are permanent employees and half are temporary employees. And surprisingly enough, doesn't surprise me because I've been looking into this matter for some years, but it may surprise you to learn that somewhere between 80 and 99% of the workforces at every one of the firms that we examined, every one of the Chinese firms, were local people. And actually we've done a study of the localization of workforces at Chinese enterprises throughout Africa, and we found that on average 85 to 86% of the workforces of Chinese companies in Africa are local people. And McKinsey & Company, the big US consultancy, did their own study in 2017. They came up with the same number as we came up with. Well, the stock of Chinese FDI in Ethiopia is not really very large, $1 billion, but due to the fact that there have been lots of Chinese infrastructure projects going on, there are some 50,000 Chinese in Ethiopia. And they have built the majority of new roads in Ethiopia. Chinese firms, of course, are very well adapted to building roads rather cheaply and fairly well. And then, of course, also building railways. But in addition, they've worked on dams, wind farms, pipelines. The most famous projects are the railway from Addis Ababa to Djibouti. Of course, there's a big port now in Djibouti, which is also run by Chinese. And then the light railway system in Addis Ababa, which we've written, and it's very cheap, and well, it seems to work relatively well, although it's extremely crowded. From 2000 to 2018, China loaned Ethiopia $12 billion US, and 65% went for energy, 27% for transport projects, and this was a little bit less than half of the external debt of Ethiopia. Of course, when we were in Ethiopia, we didn't just talk to Chinese bosses, but we also talked to a lot of Ethiopians, and we asked them about what complaints they might have about the Chinese presence, or at least what complaints they had heard. Now, it's very interesting when we ask people, what do you think of the Belt and Road Initiative? Very few people had actually heard of it, but everybody had something to say about the Chinese presence in general. And these were some of the complaints which people made. First of all, about the quality of Chinese products. As you know, Ethiopia is a very low-income country, and lots of the Chinese products being sold are very cheaply made. Actually, most of them are imported by Ethiopians to be sold in the marketplaces of Ethiopia. So they're low quality. People complain about low quality. Actually, it's particularly the middle class people who complain about the low quality, because I guess they expected they would get some great deal by buying something cheap, and it would be just as good as something that was more expensive. It isn't. And then, of course, they complained about Chinese companies being able to outbid local companies on construction projects. And this is true in many parts of the world, of course. There were complaints about bribery by Chinese companies. It was very interesting that the complaints were all addressed to private Chinese companies bribing government officials. And this may be because the people who do that are the ones in the apparel sector and these other sectors where there's medium-sized enterprises. The really big projects are state-to-state projects, and that's not necessary. There were complaints about poor language skills on the part of Chinese who had come to work in Ethiopia. This is something also that's common in many other places. And the language in question, well, it might be English, of course, but it might also be Amharic. We did meet some Chinese who could speak the local language, Amharic, and of course many more who could speak English, but a lot of Chinese who come are engineers, and they're not necessarily people who have language as their greatest forte. They're very good in mathematics, of course. And then there's the question of the work ethic. That is that the Chinese work pace is famous throughout the world as being extremely intense, whereas the work pace in Ethiopia is, shall we say, more leisurely. And therefore a lot of people objected to the fact that they went to work for a Chinese company and they have to work very, very hard to keep up with the very rapid pace of construction, particularly. And then, of course, there were questions of wages, because Ethiopia is quite a low-wage society. And it's true that most of the Chinese manufacturing companies, since they're doing clothing and textiles, typical all around the world, pay low wages. But we did an interesting comparison between the wages paid by the largest Chinese apparel manufacturer in Ethiopia and the largest European company doing manufacturing in Ethiopia. And even I was surprised to learn that actually the Swedish company, the very large Swedish company, was paying lower wages than the Chinese company was paying. So it is not necessarily something that reflects any particular proclivity on the part of Chinese companies to pay particularly low wages that are paid by local firms. Well, the Chinese government now closely regulates or even discourages investments in non-Belt and Road countries. And that's especially true of developed non-Belt and Road countries. There was a period of time when it was easy for Chinese companies to go in invest large amounts of money in the United States, in Canada, Australia, the UK, etc. It is no longer the case. Not just in terms of difficulties created by these Western countries, particularly by the United States, but by the Chinese government, which has tried to rein in the flow of investment to developed countries. But the Chinese state cannot tamp down easily the flow of investment to Belt and Road countries. And that's because, again, this is a major political and economic campaign. So if companies want to go out to developing countries, particularly to Belt and Road countries, they have to be encouraged to do so. And this is especially true with regard to Africa, because Africa is a continent with 55 countries. That's a lot of political support for China. And it's even less of a possibility for there ever to be a curbing of investment from China by the Chinese government that is going to Ethiopia, because Ethiopia is the very model of a Belt and Road country. So it has to encourage investments to go to Ethiopia, and in this way show that there is a significant Chinese contribution to the industrialization of the developing countries. Well, the Chinese government will back lots of Belt and Road projects, but it won't back everyone. For example, among all these private companies going to do manufacturing of apparel and textiles in Ethiopia, they get no support at all financially from the Chinese government. Now, they may get some kind of encouragement to go there, establish themselves, help in the industrialization process, but that's all that they would get. A study done in 2018 found that in Ethiopia, the heavily Chinese manufacturing sector, which is designated as cotton, textile, and apparel, was not considered to be a priority by the Chinese government. In a sense, the BRI then has emerged as a kind of generalization from Ethiopia's success story. Because if you look at the Chinese media, it will talk a lot about the success of Ethiopia as a developing country and China's contributions to it. And the BRI, in a way, grew out of this success story. That is the idea that we did well in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is growing fast. Ethiopia is industrializing. Let's try to replicate that model for the whole developing world, or at least a big chunk of it. So the BRI then is a way of saying that what's been done in Ethiopia, which is the capital of Africa, the bridge between Africa and the Middle East, it can also be done throughout the developing world. So the BRI's main significance is thus as a kind of guarantee. That is, China is saying through the BRI that regardless of what happens to the world economy, regardless of what we do in relationship to our investments in the developed countries, which may be curbed, we will continue to promote investment and infrastructure building and financing in the developing countries, especially in the BRI countries. And the Chinese government will make every effort to encourage that flow of capital. So even if the BRI were proven to have no added value to Ethiopia beyond the capital that has flowed there, or would have flowed there anyway, even if there was no BRI, Ethiopia would still provide an added value to the BRI. Because, again, Ethiopia is the model BRI country. Yet the BRI likely does add value in Ethiopia and also in many other BRI countries through this guarantee that I've spoken about, that there will be increased investment and increased aid. Actually, we didn't include any slides. We have many dozens of slides. showing the upsurge of investment in Ethiopia, just like there's been an upsurge in investment from China in Africa generally since the announcement of the operationalization of the BRI in 2015. So if I had a graph here, it would show 2015 here, then 2016, 17, 18, etc. So the government and people of Ethiopia do need the BRI, but China needs Ethiopia perhaps even more for the success of the BRI. So that's our very short introduction to our work, and we would be most happy to take questions from you and even to talk a little bit about Sri Lanka, because this is the second case that we're working on. Thanks very much.
I think, so let me start, let me see what my slides are. What's happened to this one? We have a blank slide? No, is it just starts here? Okay, fine. I did in reverse order. I think so we have to agree what the third narrative is, and I'll come to that at the end. One of the poster child for fear in Sri Lanka about Chinese debt and Chinese investment has come in two ways. And both of them have, in a sense, one is to say that Sri Lanka is in a significant debt trap to China, and this is compromising Sri Lanka's management of its finance as well as of its sovereignty. And that also that Sri Lanka might be, in a sense, compromised in terms of its geopolitical space because of the influence that China has in the country. I think from Verity's perspective, we think that it's quite important to attach numbers and the information we have to the narrative and to see how these two things come together. So since Hambantota Port has become the kind of center point of this discussion, I think I want to come to the question of the port also and discuss that. But let me discussing the port, because the idea is that we sold the port because Sri Lanka was in significant debt trap to China. Simply look at the numbers, because I think that that helps us to have some perspective. The large box that you see is the total external debt that Sri Lanka has, and the total amount of debt that we have to countries outside Sri Lanka. What you have here is the amount of that debt that is owned by the central government to China. This is the debt owned by China. Now, the debt to SOEs has been difficult to track, but if you track everything that we know and put it together and cross-reference it with all the data that's there, it adds another 6.2% to the 8.4% debt in the central government has. So the total external debt of Sri Lanka that China has turns out to be under 15%, which is not small. But it's hard to think of this also as the most significant source of debt that the country has. So I think when you read or listen to media narratives, you often think that China is the main source of Sri Lanka's debt and Sri Lanka is trapped to China, but actually totally only 15% of our external debt is to China. Now compare that against everything else. If I look over here, that's in 2017, what you can see is that the World Bank, ADB, Japan, all of them have comparable amounts between 10 and 15% of debt to China. So, of course, they had a lot more. ADB had 22%, World Bank had 18, even 10 years ago. Japan had 30%. So the shares that ADB, World Bank, Japan has declined. And China's share has certainly increased from 2% to 15%. So China has grown fast in terms of its debt share that Sri Lanka has, or the amount of Sri Lanka's debt that China owns. But it is not, it is not the dominant or monopolizing source of our debt. What is actually quite interesting to note is that the debt that has grown, very fast and is dominating is the debt to international financial markets and bond markets. If I take the Exim Bank out of this, this comes to about 48%. So of the international financial markets, China has about 6% of this 54, right? Which means that almost 50% of our debt is to international financial and bond markets, which is what has grown from almost, they were basically zero in 2007 because we started issuing international bonds only in 2007 or in 2006 they were zero. And we grew very fast mainly because Sri Lanka lost access to bilateral concessional debt or multilateral concessional debt post 2005 and 6. So we had to shift our debt from concessional debt to commercial debt, and that is what forces this growth of commercial debt to this level. Now that has a very significant implication for Sri Lanka because the cost of the commercial debt is quite high compared to cost of multilateral debt and even cost of bilateral debt. So this looks at the cost. What you're seeing here is that international sovereign bonds at a weighted average of 6.29% that we're getting up to the end of 2017. That rate is climbing. So basically it's getting more expensive to borrow. 6.29% is a low rate because in 2008 post-financial crisis, borrowing internationally was quite cheap. So after the US recovery and especially after this year, the price is going up. We of course had a high risk ratio during the war, but the risk ratios on Sri Lanka or the risk premiums haven't declined too much, and the ratings going down recently after October 26 last year isn't helping the price of borrowing, and we are borrowing at 8%, 8.5%, so sovereign bonds are becoming expensive. Also, the other aspect of the international sovereign bonds is that it's short-term debt, so we have to recycle that debt on average every 7 years. We contrast that with debt that's coming from China post-2012 or so. All Chinese debt has been coming in at a concessionary rate of 2%. So we had Exim Bank debt before at about between 5 to 6%. But post-2012, I think Subhash can correct me if I got the year wrong, is coming in at 2%, and Hamban report was a case in point, right? So the debt was actually at 2%, and China debt that Sri Lanka has to China is longer term debt. So on average, the debt duration is 19 years, which means you don't have to refinance it as frequently. So I think looking at it from a Sri Lankan perspective, it's important to recognize that there are significant, just simple financial advantages in borrowing from China at 2% and having 19 years to kind of sort that out and repay it, than borrowing from international financial markets at over 6% and having only 7 years in which to recycle that on average. So I think when Sri Lanka thinks strategically about how it is optimizing its own portfolio of debt, we have to ask the question, if with this fear about China, well, does it serve Sri Lanka's interest then to go to international sovereign bonds, international financial markets, where the ratings also become extremely sensitive, right? And cut in ratings and risk can affect Sri Lanka a lot. Just to demonstrate the thought process that we have at Verite is that even though people talk about the quantity of debt, that it is not fundamentally the quantity of debt that Sri Lanka has that's the problem, it's the price of debt. So there are many countries that have debt that's over 80% of GDP, that's not a good thing, we should have less. But that is not the most unusual thing, that's not what may put Sri Lanka's monetary macroeconomic position at risk. What puts our position at risk is the price we pay for that debt. Right? Because UK has over 80% GDP debt and the US has over 80% GDP debt, but the price they pay for that debt is probably around 2% or under. Right? Whereas Sri Lanka is paying between 3 to 4 times more for its debt than those countries are paying. So there was this famous statement that the Minister of Finance, once again, Mangala Samaraweera, made in his previous incarnation as minister, that 50% of Sri Lanka's new debt after 2015 was used to finance the debt that was taken from 2004 or 2005 to 2014, that is during the Mahinda Rajapaksa presidency. So that statement's unclear about whether it's repayment of capital or not, but we just simply asked the question, what was the interest cost of the debt that was taken from 2005 to 14 in relation to the new debt taken from 2015 to 17. So I'm not going to, but you realize we divided into domestic debt, foreign debt, and this is what the previous government took. So the Rajapaksa government increased, actually let me, to 2005 to 15, this is my slide, just give me a second. Yeah, that's fine. The domestic debt was 3 billion, right? That was taken. The foreign debt was 14 million US dollars. We made some estimates about the interest rate, and we made the estimates slightly conservatively. So we know that there's a lot of concession or bilateral debt that's coming in at 2%. We know that international sovereign bonds are over 6%. So we took 4%, a conservative number, as what we pay on foreign debt interest. 9% is also a conservative number, if I'm wrong, Dilshan in the back will correct me, on what Sri Lankan government pays on its local interest, right? So you pay 9%, a little less than that on very short-term treasury bills, and significantly more than that on the long-term treasury bills. So we use 9%. So doing all the math, and the current government, these are the borrowings, what you get is that 48.4% of the debt that was taken after 2015 was used to service just the interest cost of the debt that was taken from 2005 to 14. So 48.4% of the new debt, and you've seen how much we talked about how much new debt the government's taken. Now, what is the message from that? Do we say, oh, this government, the previous government borrowed too much? Well, maybe, but it is also we are paying too much for our debt. Right? Debt is too costly. And I think we have to really say when we are talking about Sri Lanka's debt problem, it may be a red herring to focus on the problem of being indebted to China. It may be more important to focus on the cost of debt and how we bring it down. Just to finish on China and Hampantha report, I think we think that there are three kinds of things that people misunderstand about that transaction. One is that we were forced into it because of a debt trap to China. I'm saying, no, we are not really debt trapped to China. We have less than 15% of our debt. And secondly, and that debt is cheaper, transactions, the money is fungible. That means that if I have a debt to China for a port that I built, I don't have to sell the port to China in order to repay that debt. I can sell the port to any one of you here, only a few of you can afford to buy it. But the US, India, the UK, anyone can pay for that port, and that frees up money to pay the debt to China. So I think the idea that just because it was the loan came from China, that it had to be sold to China, is misunderstanding the fungibility of money. And thirdly, I think the misunderstanding is that we sold that port to pay Chinese debt. We didn't. Because the Chinese debt for that port is still on our books. We sold the port and settled the international sovereign bonds and the international financial markets, which was the sensible thing to do because that is the more expensive debt. Right? So the debt trap that we were working ourselves through in selling the Hampantha report was not the trap to China, but I don't want to call it a trap, but the burden of debt to the international financial markets. And I think, getting clarity on the fact that this is not a debt for equity swap that we did, but we simply cleared out financing to settle expensive debt, as we should. gives this some perspective. I think that is quite important. So let me end by saying that it is not that we don't see problems in Chinese lending to Sri Lanka. There are some very significant benefits in the cost of debt, in the price of debt, in the duration of debt, but there are very significant issues also with the projects that have been financed with that debt. So there have been articles published by Warto University academics that show that the cost of building roads in Sri Lanka has escalated at an alarming rate, and that Chinese funded roads tend to be more expensive than roads funded by other institutions like JICA or ADB and others. And the increase in cost is more prevalent in debt that is bilaterally given, and it could be traced to Chinese debt. So it is clear that bilateral funding is escalating the cost of actually delivering or completing a project, which is a huge disadvantage to the people of the country, right? And that normally multilateral institutions create checks and balances, to some extent at least, to mitigate that problem. And I think we must take that problem quite seriously, because as you know, in terms of Sri Lanka, just because the debt is cheap, it doesn't become beneficial if the initial capital cost has been unreasonably high and not accruing benefits to the people in the country. So I think the way I would form the third narrative is to say that BRI has, as an initiative, as a lending opportunity, has hugely positive opportunities for countries like Sri Lanka. But the problem with that kind of money is that when it interacts with poorly governed countries, it can significantly compromise the benefit that accrues to people in those countries. And that has been a historic problem with multilateral debt that has been eventually fixed. So I think that, I find it a little problematic that the Chinese government hides behind the rubric of not interfering in local affairs on the basis that we have a democracy and we determine our government. That's slightly awkward for the Chinese government to take the position that democracy is great and you're getting a good outcome through democracy, because it ignores the problem of how poor governance is interacting with easy money to cause adverse outcomes for people in the country. For instance, the UK, US firms and many Western countries pass laws to criminalize bribery by their firms even in third countries. Because a lot of money creates the opportunity even for Chinese firms, any firms. And China is not unique in driving up the cost of implementing projects, okay? India does that too. You only got to look at the cost of building a railway line to Manama to realize the cost escalation. So this is not a uniquely Chinese issue. It is also a bilateral debt issue that we see whenever unregulated bilateral debt enters a country without concern about governance that it's interacting with. So basically, the fact that there is no responsibility taken by the Chinese government in implementing an extremely large transfer of financing to the poor world, to be concerned about the interaction of that financing with poor governance to disadvantage poor people, I think that can't be a free pass. Right? China must take some responsibility, as other countries have taken, and multilateral institutions have taken. And the danger, when New York Times published that article about Chinese firms potentially funding a presidential campaign and candidate, and I'm not saying Chinese are the only ones to fund that. Western countries could be funding people as well, we don't know. But we must protect our democracy. Our democracy cannot become the playground of international capacity to buy out politicians or fund them. And that is a threat we face inherently with the existence of large amounts of international funding that can flow into countries at will and is not accountable to anybody. And certainly people have no capacity to hold it accountable. And we have criticized Western nations for lending to dictators in Indonesia, in Africa, over the years, but the criticism that has been brought against Western countries for funding poorly governed authoritarian regimes over a very long period has had a consequence in causing Western governments to reform the way in which they release financing. We don't see that reform having come to China yet. Though on the positive side, I must say that China has shown a great many sort of changes in the way it deals with the world and the way it responds to the concerns of the world over the years, especially in environment. We have seen enormous positive shift in China. So I'm not saying it will not happen or that the Chinese government will not do it, but I think that concern is important, and it's important for China to respond positively to that concern and take corrective action. So I think we are looking at a situation where the third narrative is that what China is doing and the money that it's willing to put is much needed, is enormously helpful. The consequences and benefits of people then becomes a question mark. Thank you very much.